Hello, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and today we are studying Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, one of the most interesting and influential works of early American literature, and a work that encapsulates in a very remarkable way a central tension or conflict in American culture between, on the one hand, the liberal promise of individual liberty, and on the other hand, certain ideologies that in practice work to exclude people from that promise. So we'll be working today on skills of close reading, skills of literary study, reading complex texts actively, so recognizing key passages, raising questions, appreciating complexity and ambiguity. There's a lot of complexity in this text by Jefferson. And especially that third point there, understanding a text in its historical context and reacting to it from ours. So trying to understand what was the rhetorical purpose of an author in his or her historical moment, what kinds of readers was he writing to, what kinds of social issues was he or she struggling with, and then from our point of view, what seems to be of lasting value for us in studying this text. So that's really a central question with Notes on the State of Virginia. So the general thematic question I've asked you to consider in relation to Jefferson is, why does this thinker who famously proclaimed that all men are created equal, why does he not apply that liberal ideal to all persons in the state of Virginia? And who does he imagine as the ideal or full American citizen? And what groups are excluded from that vision and why? I decided to focus today on Query 4, which deals with laws. It is the most, I think, complex and troubling section of Notes on the State of Virginia, and probably the most troubling thing that Jefferson ever wrote. The historical context here is in the middle of the American Revolution. Jefferson is writing about how the Virginia Assembly met to try to draft a new code of laws that would be appropriate to a new American society, a new American society separate from England and from the king, and wrestling with the question of, in this new democratic society in Virginia, what should be done about slavery? And Jefferson reports that he had included a proposal in this legislation to emancipate the slaves in Virginia, to emancipate all slaves born after passing the act. And I want to be sure that we understand here what the specifics of his proposal are. He argues that these emancipated slaves should then be educated at the public expense in agriculture or arts of some kind. And then they should be colonized to such place as the circumstances of the time should render most proper. In other words, sent out of the United States, somewhere else to set up an independent nation of their own. And if this idea seems strange to you, you should know that this was a very widespread idea in antebellum, pre-Civil War America. Abraham Lincoln himself was very sympathetic to this idea, or professed sympathy to this idea of recolonizing freed slaves, at least before the Civil War. And then Jefferson says, after we have recolonized these slaves of ours, we need to go and recruit a bunch of white workers to come back and take their place. Now he immediately says, I know this seems like a strange idea. Why not just retain and incorporate the blacks into the state? And he argues it would be impossible, that in fact it would result in a race war. He says it would produce convulsions which would probably never end, but in the extermination of one or the other race. A really quite remarkable claim. Now Jefferson goes on, and really the rest of this section of Notes on the State of Virginia, he continues to argue why he thinks this would be the right thing to do. And in addition to that political argument, we couldn't get along and it would wind up in a race war, he says, to these objections which are political may be added others which are physical and moral. And what Jefferson really does for the rest of this section of Notes on the State of Virginia is make a racist argument. Racism being a belief that says people are different, racially different. They're different groups of people, and some are superior to others and some are inferior on the basis of their racial difference. That's what racism is. And Jefferson is making an explicitly racist argument here. He talks about skin color, and he says, isn't that important because it determines the relative beauty of white people and black people. And he says white people are more beautiful, and everybody agrees. He says, and this is really an example which is quite offensive to our 21st century sensibilities. Just like black men are more attracted to white women, we see that orangutans are more attracted to black women. Now, how in the world Jefferson would know this is, of course, an interesting question. Then he proceeds to talk about other things that he has observed, presumably as a slaveholder, and as if he is trying to marshal empirical evidence, right? What I have seen and observed about black people. He says it's really interesting they seem to require less sleep, which is a very strange argument that he makes, really. He says after they've been working hard in the field all day, they stay up at night, even though they have to get up and work again early in the morning. It seems very blind on his part. Of course, if you are a slave and you're forced to work all day from sun up to sundown, and the only time that you had to be with your family or your friends and any kind of domestic independence of your own was at night, of course you would stay up and not just go to bed. He says they're different from us in terms of sexual attraction. He says they are ardent and they have eager desire, so they have a sexual attraction, but they're not capable of the delicate and tender mixture of sentiment that white people are capable of. He says their griefs are transient. They don't grieve over their losses as deeply as white people do. How on earth Jefferson would know this is an interesting question as well. And then he says they have a disposition to sleep when they're not engaged, which makes them like animals. Because a being who does not reflect, what are you going to do with your free time? You just go to sleep. So he quite explicitly compares black people to being like animals. Then he goes on and he talks about their mental capacities. He says they don't have as much reason or imagination as white people do. None of them are capable of doing geometry. He says maybe it's a matter of their circumstances they've been raised in, except there are some black people, he says, who have been liberally educated. And even they, he says, they can't write written works, anything above the plain level of narration. They can't do any more than elementary painting or sculpture. And then he takes a contemptuous swipe at Phyllis Wheatley, the African-American poet who we're also reading in the course. And he says, religion has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but the compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. She's not a real poet, so he's very contemptuous of Phyllis Wheatley. And then he says, well, he returns to this idea, is it that blacks are naturally, inherently inferior, or is it just because they have been kept in such a condition as slaves that we make them ignorant? And so he goes then to historical evidence. He says, look at the slaves from ancient Rome and Greece. Their condition was actually worse than that of American slaves, but look at their wonderful productions. They were often rare artists and philosophers and that kind of thing. So he concludes, it is not the condition of African slaves that makes them inferior to us, but nature. Again, this is an explicitly racist argument. They are inherently inferior to us. Well, how do we as 21st century readers respond to this? What do we do with it? And I think, first of all, it's hard to read. It's just difficult to read. It's hard to hear these racist arguments coming out of the mouth of one of the founding fathers, the man who wrote that all men are created equal. I think one of the interests, and part of what's difficult about this is that Jefferson piles it on. He goes on at this argument for such a length, offering more and more evidence, different kinds of arguments. It's really excessive. It's over the top, right? And he seems so strident about making this claim. And quite interestingly, in the final paragraph of this section of Notes on the State of Virginia, after having spent all this time making this argument that yes, black people are inferior, he inserts this very interesting qualification. He says, the opinion that they are inferior in the faculties of reason and imagination must be hazarded with great diffidence. Now that's a kind of a strange language there. To hazard an opinion means that you're doing something risky, and he says with great diffidence, and diffidence means modesty or caution. And he says, look, this isn't like science where you can put something under the anatomical knife or under a microscope or chemical analysis. That's hard enough, but when it's a faculty, he says, not a substance that we are examining. Reason. intelligence. How do you measure someone's reason? How do you measure their intellect? How can you be sure? And then probably the most interesting thing, he says, let me add to, as a circumstance of great tenderness, where our conclusion would degrade a whole race of men from the rank in the scale of beings which their Creator may perhaps have given them. What Jefferson is basically saying here is, after having spent all this time piling up racist arguments, but what if I'm wrong, right? I could be wrong about this. And if I am wrong, I might be unfairly degrading human beings below the status that God gave them, right? So here we hear Jefferson, the man who says that all men are created equal, worrying about this racist argument that he has just made. Now, he nonetheless sticks by his argument and says we can't live together as blacks and whites, and we should recolonize the slaves after we emancipate them. So again, how do we as 21st century readers deal with this stridency and excess? As I said, it's hard to read these ideas, but I would say there's a value and a necessity in confronting the depth of racism in our culture's past and racism that extends into our present. I think probably most of us can agree. We can certainly see the kind of excess of Jefferson's argument and his concern about it as an expression of his own personal sense of conflict between his democratic ideals that he believed in and then his own practice and status as a slave owner. But I think more than Jefferson's personal conflicts and inconsistencies and paradoxes over this issue, there's a larger cultural or ideological significance here. Jefferson provides, I think, a striking example of how racism has been used to justify inequalities in our democratic society. In other words, if you profess that all men are created equal, how can you systematically exclude some persons from that promise unless by denying their humanity? They're not really human. Therefore, they're not included in that claim of equality. And at the same time, the urgency with which Jefferson makes his case, he's so anxious to prove this racist argument, and that revealing moment where he worries about this argument, that also provides, I think, a striking example of just how deeply contradictory and problematic racism is for a democratic culture. So as we move forward in the course, reading works of American literature from Jefferson's time up until our own, how can we see American writers continuing to wrestle with this conflict between American ideals of equality and various ideologies that justify inequality and exclusion? So you've read Jefferson. Now I've taken you through the laws section a bit. I want you to go back to the Aborigines chapter and the manufacturers section and think again about these issues. Who is Jefferson saying can be an American? What groups is he excluding and why? What are the other categories of identity or identities in Jefferson that he's concerned with? What political and ideological views are shaping his logic of inclusion and exclusion in these other chapters. So happy reading, and I can't wait to hear what you think about this very troubling and interesting issue. Thanks.